So, hello everyone, and I apologize for having problems connecting to this session. We have a fascinating topic to discuss for the next hour or so. It's about the need for global trade reform today, and the even more daunting challenge of reforming the WTO and the world trading system tomorrow. So to discuss this rather fascinating and exciting topic, we brought together four practitioners and policymakers, people who, if I may say so, live and breathe trade on a daily basis. And let me introduce them to you very, very briefly. We have Ignacio Garcia Bercero. He's director at DG Trade at the European Commission. So in the EU's engine room, pushing all those buttons that get the deals done slowly, but they get done mostly. Luisa Santos from Business Europe, overseeing Europe's business interests with a very vigilant and piercing eye across the globe. Luisa, welcome. His Excellency Jaya Ratnam, Ambassador of Singapore, very busy these days, also representing the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And I guess in a sense, Jaya made history by actually getting that EU-Singapore FTA deal done, finally, after all those years of negotiations. So, Excellency, welcome. And of course, last but not least, my colleague and dear friend, Emily Rees from ESIPE Now and Trade Strategies, your own company, and of course, one of the leading go-to analysts when we really need the inside story of what's happening. So just a few words to set the scene for this conversation. Now, do you remember, and I'm sure the four of you do, when trade was considered to be rather technical and tedious? It was all about, quotas and tariffs. You brought them up, you brought them down, and hopefully you kept them down. But that was then. In today's world, of course, trade is about geopolitics, about great power competition. It's about jobs and growth, about climate change, sustainability. So it's about our lives. And recently, we've seen that trade is also about egos, about personalities, about thrilling topics like who's going to get the job and why. We had this discussion in Brussels following a little saga. Now that thrill and that excitement is over, the suspense is over, but we still have the WTO, the World Trade Organization, going to get a new Director General. And there's a lot of speculation about who that should be. But more seriously, trade is very, very vital to our economies. And as we move out of the lockdowns, hopefully, we're going to see that it's going to be essential for the recovery, for a sustained and green recovery. So we have to keep barriers down and trade flowing. Secondly, of course, it's also, and I've seen this as a reporter and as an analyst for the last few years, very reflective of a changing global order. I still remember a time when the United States and the EU could get it together, maybe with a few other so-called like-minded countries, and get a deal done in the WTO. Well, guys, that's changed. It's not happening anymore. And not just because of China and India and Brazil, but also because other voices have come up, including, Ambassador, if I may say so, countries like Singapore. And finally, trade is also reflective and highlights how much we are connected to each other and how interdependent we are. And I think these are the different complexities that make trade such an exciting beat for people like Emily and myself, but also for the rest of you who are in the heart of the context, if you like. So let me start off, and I thought we'd do it in a rather simple way because I was looking at the list of things we need to discuss, and oh my God, it's pages long, and we don't have that much time, and also we need to be focused. Let's be focused. So let's start off with all four of you responding to a question that I think is important. What are the three priorities for you in this long list? Where are the three areas where you think we really need to act quickly in terms of liberalization or reform or whatever you think is necessary? So tell me that, and then tell me why you think so. So let me kick off with the man in the engine room, Ignacio, for the Commission, doing its review now and looking ahead to a new, maybe a transatlantic partnership, maybe a change in government in the United States, maybe a China that is more emollient and listens to the EU. What are your three priorities?
Thank you very much, Chad. And I have to say that In the 30 years almost I have been working in the European Commission, I don't really remember the time when trade was technical and boring. I think it has been quite exciting for quite some time. But if I want to mention 3 priorities, they all relate to one fundamental issue, which is WTO reform. I think we are facing the most fundamental crisis of the rule-based trading system since it was created. I think that the importance of having a functioning WTO, now that we have a functioning WTO, is more clear than ever. So what I would do is I would just highlight 3 things which I think are critical if you want to get the WTO back into the right track. The first one is relevance. The WTO needs to demonstrate that it is relevant for the issues that matter to business, that it is relevant for the issues that matter to public opinion. And that, I think, is the fundamental question that the WTO needs to show first of all. There are different ways to do this. There are some initiatives which are particularly important in this connection. There is the work which is being done on e-commerce, the whole digital dimension. There's the initiative that we, together with other countries in the Ottawa Group, are working on trade and health that will show, hopefully, that the WTO can respond to the situation created by the pandemic. There's the whole sustainability dimension. I think this concept of relevance, I think, is the absolutely critical things that the WTO needs to demonstrate, again, to public opinion, to policymakers. The second, you have mentioned, of course, that we are living in a world of geopolitical conflict, and it's the US-China geopolitical conflict. But it's a conflict which is being played out primarily in the trade and technology arena. And I think it would be a little bit absurd to pretend that we can work on reforming the WTO without also finding a way of the WTO being relevant for containing at least this conflict. That's why the issues relating to what we call the level playing field, how to respond to the issue of subsidies, which is a Chinese issue, but it is broader than the Chinese issue. This is something which, again, is going to be very challenging. I don't think this is something that's going to be resolved as quickly as the others, but again, you need to find a way of channeling those issues through a rule-based approach, and that's why, again, the WTO should be at the center of that. And then, finally, there's the issue of stability. The really fundamental function that the WTO has been able to perform for 25 years is to give stability to business, is to give stability to traders, and knowledge that there were some rules that all players, including the biggest players, were ready to respect. And if there was a difference about how those rules were implemented, there was a procedure to deal with that, WTO dispute settlement. So that is, of course, the other third fundamental challenge, how to restore the binding two-step WTO dispute settlement. We have been acting together with a number of countries to try to keep it functioning at the coalition of the willing. But of course, the fundamental issue is that we hope that the United States, at some point in time, will be ready to engage on the discussion that will be necessary to restore this universally for all WTO members. So I would say relevance, the WTO needs to demonstrate its relevance. Level playing field, the WTO needs to be able to provide a rule-based response to the US-China conflict, and the stability is to finding a way of restoring WTO dispute settlement.
Thank you very much, Ignacio. Yes, the 3 issues that you think, and you talked about also relevance to public opinion, and we've seen how important public opinion has become in this discussion. Just for everyone watching and listening, I did not say to you, but I will ask these questions, and then I do want you to come in through the chat, and my colleague Igor will be watching the chat frame very, very carefully. So please do come in with your questions and comments. Luisa, let me turn to you from the business point of view. So Ignacio set out really the broader issues, and I think the question of e-commerce, of course, is a very important one. Where do you see the priorities, the 3 top areas that you think we need to change?
Thank you, Shada, and good afternoon, everyone. Well, actually, Ignacio, you could be speaking on behalf of Business Europe, because I couldn't agree more on the priorities you set, because they're also connected directly with the business needs and the value that business sees in the WTO. So one of it is stability and predictability is having the same rules across an important number of countries. I think this is the pillar of the WTO, and we have 164 countries, and this is still increasing. So we still have more countries joining, and that's important that we have a common set of rules. So I would say this is the first priority for business. But of course, these rules no longer match the business reality. And Ignacio already alluded to this. We need, and this is very much related to the reform, we need new rules to address the importance of services in the economy, and including digital services, of course, and e-commerce and digital trade are critical. You mentioned it, Shada. So definitely relevance of services in the economy. We also need the rules to adjust to sustainability and the priorities that we now see more and more to address climate change. I think this is critical. It's also part of the importance of making sure that trade remains something that people see as positive and not as negative. So we need to respond to the citizens' requests that we look more into addressing climate change. So I think here we also need to change, and we also need to adjust the rules. The other point is also with adjusting the rules, and Ignacio already mentioned it, is the question of the level playing field. And a level playing field is related to the change in power. I mean, we have a balance of power, economic power, but also political power that has changed significantly in the last years. I mean, Chada and Ignacio already alluded, we had initially the system that came out of the Second World War, where basically the power was in the Western world. There is a shift now to Asia. Role of Latin America, of Africa. So, and we have growing economies that have a huge economic power and it took over a number of important areas in trade. China is, of course, the most important, but we're also talking about India, we're talking about Brazil. So all this is not really matched in the existing rules. And this comes to this question of the special and differentiated treatment, but is also that we need to address subsidies. We need rules on competition. So this is new areas that we also need to take into account. And my of course, the other point is implementing rules, and that the dispute settlement, that is key. Of course, you don't only need rules. I mean, you need more than the paper tiger. You need something that is really enforceable. And as we always say, behind any dispute, there is a company. And we need this system to be effective. I mean, we cannot have situations as we have today for the Airbus Boeing case, for instance, where we have a decision on the US more than a year ago, and we are still waiting for the decision on the EU case and the Airbus case. So this kind of situation diminish the trust in the system. Final point, monitoring. I think this is critical for business as well. Part of the WTO work, and we saw it during the pandemic, is to monitor trade restrictions, is to, calling on countries to assess the measures taken and withdraw them if they are protectionist. And part of this is also related to the notifications. And this is an area also where we need some improvements. So this would be my initial remark. Thanks.
Yes, Luisa. So in a sense, both of you are on the same track, the common set of rules, level playing field, listen to the citizens. We also need to bring in the new topics into the WTO, and of course, the issue of monitoring. And we saw the need for monitoring, didn't we, Jaya, during the lockdown when countries were basically doing a little bit of what they wanted to do. And even within the EU, the situation was extremely messy and really, I think, not up to what we were expecting. But let's ask you now. So we talked about the big geopolitical shifts, and we've talked about great power competition and how the US-China trade and tech war are really casting a very dark shadow over the trade landscape from a country like Singapore. And I say a country like Singapore because you're a powerful, small country and in a region which is growing very, very dynamically and very vibrant region with the economies. And of course, you stand at the center of ASEAN in many ways. So Jaya, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for that really wonderful but rather overstated introduction. I think Singapore is extremely trade dependent. Trade is 3 times our GDP, so this is our lifeblood for us. So it's an existential issue when you're looking at the multilateral trading system. And for us, and I fully share the landscape that has been sketched out by both Ignacio and Luisa. What is needed is a functioning multilateral trading system. The key is how to make it functional. And the key to that is that in the WTO, when I was there a decade ago, we always said the WTO is a member-driven association. It really, the fingers point back at us. There is no WTO. It is actually the members. It is up to us to solve this. And we have done a terrible job over the past years doing so. And now we are paying the price for doing that terrible job. We are doing a terrible job not because we do not know the issues, we do not know the solutions, but we can't get the politics right. And we really need to get the politics right to ensure that we get the right solutions. That's my first point. My second point is, as you say, we are in the midst of a fundamental shift in the way economies are organized, in the way trade is done. We are seeing the repercussions of the past. The geopolitical tensions that we talked about existed over the past few years. It's just grown and grown. Same for technological and other innovations in terms of reshaping. What COVID has done is exacerbated it and reinforced some of these tendencies. At the same time, we are forced to deal with what we always call the problems of the future, but the problems of the future are now digital and sustainable development, or in the EU's context, the green agenda. We have to deal with the intersection of all these 3 issues now. And then it comes back. How do you make your multilateral system functional? How do you make it deliver outcomes? Because negotiations is not outcomes. Negotiations are process. Process needs to deliver outcomes. Now, when economic pain is real all around the world, I think the pressure is on us to deliver outcomes. And my final point would be that in terms of doing this, inevitably we have to look at second best outcomes. The best outcome, of course, is to have the WTO work according to perfection. But we all know the WTO never worked according to perfection. It was always a work in progress. But we also look at second best outcomes. And Michael mentioned the EU's effort, which Singapore joined in terms of ensuring the dispute settlement part of the WTO remains functional with the multi-party interim arrangement. This is a key part to ensure at least the WTO remains functional in one key part, which is enforcement. But we are also looking at other ways to do so. Updating the rule books. The JSI on e-commerce is an excellent initiative on this. These initiatives should be supplemented and complemented both at the regional level with the EU and other regions, including ASEAN, and then also at the bilateral level, so that we can do it at a variety of levels. At the end of the day, what we want is outcomes. We want to see how we can move forward rather than spend more time talking about the issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jaya. So a very important point, really, that is really about the member states, and that truly it hasn't been very, very impressive what the member states have been doing with the WTO. Also the economic pain, and then, of course, the dispute settlement and the appellate body, important as well. Emily, I just wanted to ask you, first of all, your 3 points where you think, we should really be converging on, and there should be a consensus to get things done, right? But there's a question that's come in from Ryan Hunter, and it's a very good one. It says, can the EU credibly lead a reform agenda at the WTO? Can it bring on board the countries who are skeptical and don't fall into the like-minded category, if you like? So first, your 3 points, and then if you could, as the independent person here, give us your insights.
Thank you, Shada. And what is there to add after three absolutely amazing insights? But perhaps, I mean, the 3 points consider the 3 pillars which are under threat at the multilateral level, and that's the 3 pillars of the WTO, which is the monitoring and transparency pillar that Louisa raised. We saw a number of trade restrictions come into play that were during the COVID pandemic, or at least at the beginning. The negotiating pillar, which has been blocked now for quite a substantial time, where there are some very big challenges that need to be addressed. And in that pot, I would bring up 2 specific issues, which is the one of subsidies. We need to have a real debate around subsidies, not only about a discussion where we do go into the more divisive issues, the ones which are really the ones which are blocking things today, which is the question of what constitutes a public body in the WTO and how we can bring in state-owned enterprises and other elements of the managed economy that we're going to see more of within the disciplines of subsidies and countervailing measures. But also we need to look at subsidies from a number of other points of view. So we've got a fisheries subsidy negotiation that needs to be closed in order to reach our sustainability objectives. We need to talk about trade distorting subsidies in agriculture. We need to talk, if we're looking at sustainability, about subsidies on fossil fuels, should they still exist? And we need to look at subsidies when they relate to implementation of the Paris Agreement. But those are some examples. Another issue perhaps that wasn't brought up by my fellow panelists here is the question of special and differentiated treatment. So this is the provisions that were put into place so that developing countries could insert into global value chains. Now, many of them have and are still using a number of these provisions. And this is also quite a divisive issue that needs to be tackled. And I understand that Singapore and alongside other countries such as Brazil has made some steps in the right direction in that particular field. But if we go into perhaps we talk about the dispute settlement, so the 3rd pillar also that needs to be addressed. I think that's been well covered here. We can go into perhaps what needs to be done in that realm, but I would like to address perhaps the question of the pandemic, because as it's been said, we are transitioning into a more geo-economic order. I think that's really the word of the day, where we're having more security policy coming into trade and more trade issues going into security and defense policy. This is going to be a real difficulty to tackle in the WTO without a real rediscussion on how to manage this from a rules basis. And I would add that COVID essentially magnifies these pre-existing questions and challenges. And what we need to do now is not only look at the reform of the WTO to respond to the trade aspects of the pandemic and the recovery that's going to be needed, but also trade is going to have a very important role in preventing the next pandemic. So maybe we can touch upon that as well.
Thank you very much indeed. I think you've really pointed to some of the issues that are going to be very, very controversial to discuss. I mean, this issue of subsidies. And as you said, Emily, if we in Europe start also providing some help to our own companies, even if we say it's for a limited time, what kind of a message and what does that impact on the subsidy discussions? You mentioned also agriculture, special and differential treatment, and the mix of security. Also the pandemic and what that means for global or regional supply chains. That you did avoid the question about, or you didn't avoid, you missed the question. And the EU, does the EU, from your point of view, have the credibility to sort of bring countries together, rally countries together on a reform agenda? Do we have, as Europeans, the geo-economic clout to do that, do you think?
Well, the EU has always been a cooperative player in the multilateral trading system. Now I believe that part of the new assertiveness that we're going to see from the European Union could either help in bringing other players to the table to discuss these very difficult issues, or could play the other way around, whereas the EU becomes also so assertive that it's not able to actually become a peace broker. So this is really actually a question that I would very much like to hear from the other speakers and their views.
Yeah, I'm going to ask Ignacio. Ignacio, the EU, okay, so I've been watching this, as you know, for decades, right? So at one point, Europeans were the bad boys because of common agriculture policy and the subsidies and the rest of it. And that really tarnished our reputation. More recently, we've sort of been the good boys. And that's not just because of the Americans sort of taking a different stance, not just because of the Chinese, because we've put our house in order, in a sense. In many ways, Europe has done its homework, right? Do we, in this new era that we're talking about, this new geopolitical shift, do we have that sense of credibility and rallying power, uniting power, unifying power?
Oh, yeah. No, that's a great question, Chada. First, let me say that I think that we have already demonstrated leadership in what happened to restore among a coalition of the willing the functioning of the binding two-step dispute settlement. That has been the major effort. That's something that we started first with Canada, then we outreached to a broader group of countries, and we have managed to put in motion together with others something which is solid and which, of course, doesn't include at this point in time the United States, but it's a stepping stone, we hope, to a broader effort for reform. And we have been discussing WTO reform with a very broad and varied group of countries. We have been involved with the United States and Japan in the trilateral exercise, but we also open up a working group to discuss with China WTO reform. We are very much an active participant of the Ottawa group, which includes a very broad coalition of countries working on WTO reform. And I think we need to do more. I'm convinced, for instance, that we need to outreach much more to Africa. Africa is going to be a very important player when it comes to the definition of the future WTO agenda. And I think we need to do more in terms of engaging with African countries to try to see how also their perspectives can be integrated in an effort which has to be inclusive. I think that the key for WTO reform is, on the one hand, you need to be inclusive. You need to try to keep the door open for everyone. But at the same time, you should not tolerate vetoes. When you actually have a coalition of countries which are ready to move ahead, which are ready to do useful work in the WTO, it's simply not acceptable that things stop because a country says, sorry, we don't want this to happen in Geneva. That's what I think what is going on with the joint statements initiatives is so important. That shows that there's an appetite for countries to work forward, to develop the WTO rule book. And if countries are not obliged to participate, but the law at the same time is open for all countries to participate. Of course, there's still going to be some challenges when we conclude negotiations on e-commerce. For instance, how are we going to integrate this into the WTO? There are some difficult questions that will have to be touched. But my sense is that from the political point of view, this is going to be the key priority for European Union trade policy. That was already indicated by President von der Leyen when she entrusted the Trade Commissioner to develop a strategy WTO reform. And I would very much expect that in this review of trade policy that we are currently undertaking, that what comes out from this review, I would expect would give new ideas and new impulse to this strategy of WTO reform. But it's going to require a big effort. It's going to require alliance building. It's going to require dealing with some topics which are uncomfortable, which perhaps are not the ones that we would most like to discuss. But clearly, you also need to be able to integrate the priorities of others.
Right, and I would say that at the moment there's so much of firefighting going on in terms of trying to contain, as you said, the fallout from the US-China competition, in terms of making sure that, China plays by the rules in WTO. So there's a lot of emergency work going on, making sure that the appellate body functions, etc. So we haven't really had time to look at the longer term repercussions. But let me turn to Luisa and Jaya and ask you also, what are the trends you see? Now, Ignacio hinted at plurilateralism sort of winning, because you can't bring such different opinions, there's different types of governments sometimes on board for one way forward. So do you see plurilateralism as becoming kind of like the second best option, perhaps? And how would the business respond to that? Because you've got common rules, that will not be really common rules. Luisa.
Shada, that's a very interesting and pertinent question. Of course, ideally, everyone should accept the rules, and this is preferable for business to give some stability and predictability. The question is, when you are faced between the dilemma, you prefer to have rules that are not really fit for your reality, that everyone's applying, but in the end, they are not good for you? Or do you prefer rules that are better for you, but even if they are not applied everywhere, at least you have a good common basis with a number of your important trading partners? Of course, the big question on all this is that plurilaterals are the answer if they include your major trading partners, and this could be different according to where you stand. I mean, for Europe, of course, ideally, this makes sense if you have the US and China, because they are among the two major trading partners. Of course, if you are maybe somewhere else in Asia, you have other perspectives. So the question is the likelihood that you have, agreements being made according to also your regional preferences and your economic model is very high. And this is why, of course, plurilaterals are the second best option. But they are a little bit better than free trade agreements, where you're only doing bilaterally and not only doing with one partner and not with the others. Of course, if you are the EU, since you have a large network of free trade agreements, this is also good to build up a number of rules that you can afterwards also exploit with plurilaterally with other countries. My final point is on the plurilateralism. I mean, the big question, and I think this is very much the basis also in the discussions in the WTO, is of course that we are doing this on a most favored nation treatment, because it is the rule base in the WTO. But we have countries starting to demand, well, if we don't solve the issue of the special and differentiated treatment, and you don't have a number of obligations that are matching your weight, economic weight and trade weight, I think the future of plurilaterals as we know it is also in question, because you will have more and more countries saying, well, I'm not prepared to give something to China or India or Brazil without, on a free basis, without getting something in exchange from them. So free riding is going to be a critical point. So that's why the question of balance, of adapting the system to the new reality, the new economic reality, is very, very important, because from there you have a lot of implications and ramifications. If China doesn't accept that it has become a huge economic power and starts playing the game, then I think it's going to be very difficult to have a broad consensus or even plurilateral agreements that are really meaningful in this sense.
Thank you. Very, very good point about getting more countries with real power, trading power, firepower on board for plurilaterals for them to matter. I have to say that I've always had the one kind of a dream, a vision that all of our different FTAs at one point we could bring them under one umbrella and then harmonize rules across the board. But that I'm going to ask you that question about whether we need we need a WTO reform, or do we need a WTO breakup, and then have more sort of sectoral agencies working on sectorally important issues, e-commerce, government procurement, stuff like that? I don't know. I'm going to put that question to you, so think about it. But Jaya, I wanted to ask you about another trend that's emerging, and emerging has been very much there, is regionalization. You, of course, ASEAN, 10 countries working together, we 27. But ASEAN's at the sort of a hub of all kinds of FTAs with China, Australia, New Zealand, Korea, Japan, also working to try and broaden the ASEAN agreement to New Zealand and Australia. And so is regionalization, regional supply chains, are these the sort of things that we should be looking out for as the world changes the coming years?
I think when you're looking at ASEAN, you're looking at a group of countries that's rather promiscuous when it comes to free trade, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It is by definition a landscape, but at the same time, what we seek is an open architecture in which we get to engage with whoever wants to engage us at mutually acceptable terms. That allows us to house a whole series of bilateral agreements, a network of bilateral agreements, a network of regional agreements, network of cross-regional agreements, and also a network of plurilateral agreements like the CPTPP, or as in the latest ones with Singapore, Chile, and New Zealand on the digital economy. So there are many, many different pieces moving around, mainly because we recognize that we cannot let the perfection be the enemy of the good. And we just have to move where we can, where the bridge will hold the weight. So that's my first point. It is a very messy landscape. At the same time, plurilaterals do have, I fully recognize Louisa's point, but in this messy landscape, plurilaterals do have a little bit of value in terms of rationalizing some of these messiness. Because plurilaterals do not cause the messiness already exists. Plurilaterals can do so. I want to come back to Emily's point about COVID and dealing with it, and I think Ignacio mentioned the key EU initiative in terms of for the DSM, but also the EU has a very interesting initiative on healthcare, and a bilateral initiative on healthcare, which is a step in the right direction. The sort of things that we need to address COVID, not just COVID, but future pandemics. Which brings me to the last point. The WTO does not exist in isolation when it comes to trade. It also exists as part of a broader multilateral framework. So you mentioned regionalism. What you're seeing right now, and what is first and foremost right now in terms of the problems we face relating to COVID are two: closure of borders and vaccines. Both are interrelated. When it comes to vaccines, the WTO, of course, has a role to play in terms of facilitating the smooth flow of supply chain. But specifically, it's the WHO which has a key role to play in terms of production and distribution of vaccines. In that regard, the EU, again, coming back to whether the EU can show leadership, the EU is showing incredible leadership in supporting the COVAX facility, which is key to ensuring a fair and equitable distribution of vaccines around the world. Support for the multilateral framework, actually, it is not just one institution. It's a multi-faceted set of institutions that need to work together towards one common objective. So what we also need to do is also ensure some institutional coherence across the various institutions so that they are mutually supportive.
Thank you very much, Jaya, for pointing that out. Yes, the multilateral coherence. So the left hand and the right hand are working in the same direction. I mean, the WHO and the WTO in this case, obviously, if we're talking about the pandemic. Emily, if you'd like to comment on some of the things you've heard, some of the, and plurilateralism, but also a question that I know is of specific interest to you is the climate change agenda and trade. And there, you've been I think one of the people here in Brussels, maybe in Europe, who's been looking at the Mercosur agreement in some detail. And of course, we talked about security impacting on trade, but the carbon tax issues, the forest fires, deforestation, all of these issues in the public mind are all part of the trade discussion. So any comments from you on that would be very valuable. Thank you.
That's and I think that really, upon Jaya's point, right, trade has a role to play in the COVID recovery and its prevention. And I think that one of the points that we often don't hear so much about is the prevention part. So first, what can we do in terms of, I think, tackling for what there is a global pandemic by its own nature. And if anything, this is a moment to rally around a topic which is relevant to all humanity. And in doing so, there are a number of very specific proposals that can be put forward. One which is the Zero for Zero initiative, which is the pharmaceutical agreement, which can be hopefully brought to the whole membership so that we can eliminate tariffs on health products, on medical products that are necessary to countries. It's amazing how many countries still have high tariffs on protective equipment and on different medical goods. So this is a very simple example of what can be done. Another very quick, I think, document guidance that needs to be devised by the WTO membership is a guidance on the sharing of scarce medical goods. So what happens when there is a vaccine? There is a role, as you said, for the WHO in this, but there is a role for the WTO also in guiding a number of these actions. And then we come to what can we do to prevent the next epidemic? And I think that comes back to your earlier point on should we have multiple agencies dealing with all of these issues in silos? Well, what we learned from the last SARS epidemic was that actually all of these issues are related. Climate change, agriculture, food safety, deforestation, human health, biosecurity, antimicrobial resistance, it's all part of the same pot. And that's why the world, all the UN membership came together under the auspices of the FAO, UNICEF, the World Bank, and adopted key principles called One World, One Health principles. Now, these principles now need to be transferred into the rules of trade. I think this is very essential because what they basically explain is that humans, animals, and the ecosystem work in interface with each other. And this is core to the prevention of the next epidemic, which we know that, okay, this time it caught everyone by surprise, but there really is no excuse to not be putting in the right preventative measures. And that's where climate change and these other issues that you mentioned come into play.
Right. And if there was someone from India on this panel, sorry, have you finished, Emily? I was saying if someone from India had been on this panel, they would also say that the COVID-19 has shown the need for mobility of health workers across borders because we need quick help from doctors, medical experts, nurses. And I think those are very important issues that you've outlined. Now, moving on, I just wanted to come back to that question that I put to you. Such a vast agenda. You'll see that I'm deliberately avoiding questions to do with Brexit. I don't want this to be a debate about Brexit and the WTO. God knows that's raging out there, but that's not our point here. Neither do I want to talk about, whether there'll be a new administration, how that will impact in the US, and how it will or not impact on the WTO. Will the Americans be back? I don't want to talk about that. And obviously the new Commissioner for Trade here in the EU will have a vast agenda that he has to deal with. No, I want to talk about the next DG of the WTO, and not to say who's your preference. Ignacio already said it's time to be inclusive. and he mentioned Africa. So I think we all know, and most of us are rooting and hoping this will be the case. But just for a second, imagine that I'm a fairy godmother, and I've come and I've said, Louisa, you are the next DG for WTO, and here's a wand, and throw it around and make the 3 changes you think are necessary. And I'm going to ask all 4 of you to respond to that. Louisa, if I may start with you. From the business side, and I know you've got your wish list, but you have to act fast now. The world is moving on. People are saying WTO is completely old-fashioned, outdated, break it up, let's do something different this time around. What would you be doing?
Well, I would start by building credibility and trust. And I think, of course, if I am elected, or whoever gets to be elected, it also has some proof of trust. But I think very fast he will be put, or she will be put under huge pressure to deliver very fast. And I think one of the most important aspects is to have, at the very early stage, a strong support from the key countries, the key trading partners at high level. Because otherwise, the risk we have is, of course, the US will continue its own unilateral approach. China will continue to react, also saying that it respects the rules in WTO, but in fact it doesn't, because it does something else. And the EU will continue its way. So I think that the new person will need to, at a very early stage, sit with this, at least with this, without forgetting India, without forgetting Brazil, South Africa, and so on. But to try to talk not at technical level, but political level. Is there a political commitment on support for multilateralism and the WTO? That's the first point. And then, because that point is connected to the power of the DG, because this has been one of the main discussions also among members, is, of course, this is a member-driven organization, but so is the Commission, although the Commission has the initiative in some areas like trade, but also our organizations like Business Europe. This does not prevent, of course, you from trying to propose something or trying to broker a compromise. So I think it's also a question of how much leverage and how much ability and flexibility and ability to act are you prepared to give to the DG? And I think this is critical, because if we start from a basis where the DG is, running the secretariat, just a figure without any power, I think this is not going to work well. And I also think it's important, and I think some of the candidates have mentioned it, it's important to revise the organization. Is the way the organization structures still in line with the realities? We see that, I'm not questioning the competence of the people, but when we see all male management in the WTO, is this still reflecting the reality of today's society? So I think this would be the initial points. And then, of course, we can tackle all the rest, dispute settlement, the rules, what needs, because we have not mentioned it, but one of the things where the new DG will face huge pressure is what will be the deliverables in Nur Sultan next ministerial. So I think this is going to be the one of the key pressure points also from members to build credibility in the organization.
Yeah, thank you, Louisa. Thank you very much. So very much focusing on the coalition building credibility of the next DG to try and rally people around. We are about 10 minutes away from wrapping up, so I would ask the others to come in on that as well. And also, what I liked, what you said was also we're an ideas festival, right? So let's come up with audacious, bold ideas, even if they seem not deliverable at the moment, but let's think ahead. So Njaya, let me turn to you now.
Well, leadership is important and critical at this juncture, clearly. But then we also must recognize the limits of what a leader can do if the followers don't want to go in that direction, which is why Luis's point is critical in terms of coalition building and building up a consensus. For me, the immediate task would be, coming back to the framework we had, the WTO's key function, the monitoring function. The monitoring function right now in terms of export restrictions, in terms of subsidies, because as governments move in to support industries, to support their economies, we are seeing the rebuilding of a subsidy framework that has not existed for decades. And how do you manage it? How distorting are these new structures, and how do you wind down these structures so that you can reopen economies moving forward? Because the legacy of COVID in terms of both export restrictions and subsidies are far more closed economies. And then if you take on the third dimension of supply chains and pressures for reshoring and more secure sources of supplies, what does this all mean for trade when you put these three things together? So I would think that would be a key priority, because this will affect future trade flows. Already the WTO is registering the lowest trade flows since it recorded in 2007 for merchandise trade. It is obvious why, but then it is not going to revive just because we move out of it, if the structures that we leave behind to manage COVID create blockages for the future. Thanks.
Jai, just very quickly, you said something, the reshoring debate and the debate on, the action on subsidies and all that. But, WTO is not a policeman. I mean, it monitors, it can give guidance, and only in very rare cases, I think in dispute settlement in some states. So how do you bring these maverick, well, no maverick, and how do you actually rein them in and get them to agree on a common kind of standards now? I mean, this recovery period, hopefully. How do you do that?
With great deal of difficulty. But the reality is the WTO is the only institution that has the technical capacity to actually monitor to see what is happening. And we actually have no a good sense of the picture that is building up. And I think all we have is the sense of what we are doing individually as countries. I think what we need is a far more holistic sense of what we are doing and how does this affect all our interests as we move forward. I think the WTO has a key role to play in that. In terms of unwinding or redoing some of the things that we have done, you're absolutely right. The WTO's ability to do so, that would turn on this negotiating function and the members' ability to negotiate. But this does add a new degree of complexity to the negotiations already in place in the WTO and the outcomes we expect from those negotiations.
Right. Right, exactly. So a lot of work has to be done on peer pressure and transparency and possibly naming and shaming, etc. So Ignacio, so you've been given a fantastic promotion, and I do wish that one day you will get to be the WTO Director General. And now we have 6 minutes left. What will you do? First 2-3 things that you will do.
Well, I think the Director General should be a politician, so I'm not a candidate. But in terms of 3 things which I think the new Director General should do, first, he or she should be very proactive, should be ready to take initiatives, at the same time inclusive. It's important that the new Director General is able to discuss with all the different players in the WTO, not only with the big players. Secondly, I think the new Director General should very much have in mind the importance of achieving some meaningful outcomes by NC12 in order to demonstrate the relevance of the WTO and to build a certain positive energy within the WTO system. I think the two issues which I would suspect would hit further in terms of relevance is trade and health, an initiative on trade and health, which is as broad as possible. Let's see how many countries are ready to rally behind this initiative. There is, of course, fisheries subsidies, which is important in itself, but important as a demonstration that, yes, the WTO can deliver on the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. And then as much progress as possible on these joint statement initiatives, digital commerce. I don't think it's very realistic to expect that those would necessarily be concluded by the time of NC12, but as much progress as possible, and I think on as inclusive basis as possible. And thirdly, I think that the new Director General should also be to try to be sure that there is an agreement in MC12 to set up a broader process of WTO reform, a process which is inclusive, but which allows a real exchange of views among the members of the WTO, probably under the leadership of the DG, to see how the functioning of the organization can be improved. So those would be my three recommendations for whoever gets the job.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. Take initiatives, be the leader, build coalitions, but monitor and be tough at the same time. So yeah, it's a complicated task for a complicated world. Emily, please.
I think just echoing what Ignacio just said, Nur Sultan, the MC12 really is going to be the kickoff to the wider modernization process, but we need to have the low-hanging fruit agreed to. We need some successes here, and we know what are the dossiers that have the most opportunity, let's say, to have those successes. If we look back to Nairobi, the fact of having managed an agreement on restrictions to export subsidies was viewed as quite an achievement, and we need more of those. So fisheries is definitely one, as Ignacio mentioned, that would also point in the right direction in terms of responding to citizens' concerns that the WTO is in the game of looking at its commitments towards the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals as it relates to trade-related issues, obviously. But the health initiative also, I believe that there are some very key elements that can happen in Nur Sultan and that they need to be the kickoff. And I would also add, what we need by the time we get to Nur Sultan is at least an agreement on some of the more, let's say, housekeeping elements, which is the institutional aspects of the secretariat function and the role of the Director General, perhaps with more degree of proposals, initiation of proposals coming from the head of the WTO in order to drive this next era, hopefully, of the World Trade Organization.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Emily. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there is a question of driving forward and taking leadership. It's going to be an even more complicated world. We haven't really spoken, and I think we all know that public opinion matters, credibility with the public matters. We know that much of this will be increasingly difficult without an engaged America, an engaged American administration. I'm hoping that we can all work together to get the next era sorted, in a sense. And I'm inspired a little bit by a conversation I had this morning with Martin Sandbu, who is the FT economics editor, commentator. And he's written a book called The Sense of Belonging and how liberalism can actually be made great again. And he's come out as a great defender of globalization and made some very, very, very lucid points in his book about how we can make globalization and open economies great again and relevant again and credible again. So my wish for the next Director General is to make globalization a good thing again and to fight off all the naysayers who say, let's build more walls, more tariffs, more quotas. economic nationalism is the way forward. It is not. And if we're going to have a recovery, a sustained, green, humane, compassionate recovery, we really will have to work together, and trade will be the driver. So I'd like to wrap up on that note. I'd like to thank all of you, Jaya, Emily, Luisa, Ignacio. Great to meet all of you again. And thank you very much for participating and giving your ideas to this festival of ideas. Thank you and bye-bye. And thank you all for watching and listening and commenting on Twitter and other social media. Bye-bye. Stay safe. Stay happy. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.